The rain fell heavily, blending into the pitch-black night. The drops pounded the street, intensifying the chill and the silence of a city that seemed forgotten. And in that moment, David stepped in, his slender figure draped in an old coat, just enough to shield a man who had once ruled empires, but had now become a wanderer in the darkness of his own life. Millbrook was no stranger to David. It had once been his passion, an eatery nestled in a peaceful neighborhood, a place that had once brought warmth and joy to many. But now it was just the shell of a dream that had faded. David's steps no longer carried the glamour of his past, but were a quiet return, like a traveler seeking himself in the midst of an aimless journey. The door creaked open, and the sound of the rain beating against the window panes was like a sad, wordless song. The surroundings seemed weary. The scent of garlic butter and oregano, which once delighted the guests, now felt suffocating, like the smoke from a fire that had only just been extinguished. That fragrance no longer brought familiarity, but only the remnants of an undeniable failure. Era, the lead server, walked over. Her hands trembled as though she were holding something fragile rather than a menu. Her eyes sparkled with fear and a deep sadness she could not conceal. She placed a napkin on the table, not to add formality, but to conceal a message, a warning that David could not ignore. This warning did not come from a stranger. It came from Era, a server with a history as difficult as David's, who had once been a waiter himself. But now he was no longer the one carrying dishes. He was an outsider, watching a world that was slowly crumbling. David had once been a man of work, of sleepless nights, of grueling hours in the kitchen. He had once been a man with no name, but now David Marlowe was known in many places, from boardrooms to upscale dining establishments. Though successful, the memories of those early days never left him. He still remembered the feeling of being a young man with hands scarred and calloused, yet with a vow in his soul. One day work would bring respect and dignity, not humiliation. Yet success had not erased those memories. David still carried a void inside him, and his return was to face what had been forgotten, the unresolved mistakes. Millbrook was no longer a symbol of prosperity, but of neglect and decay. And now David had to face himself, confront what he had built and allowed to fall apart. The biggest question now was not how to save the restaurant, but whether he could save the trust that had been lost. When the napkin was placed down, the unspoken warning began to sink deep into David's mind. The feeling he once knew of being a server, someone who had seen every corner of a restaurant on the brink of collapse, returned stronger and clearer than ever before. He looked at the napkin, then directed his gaze toward Ara. She was trying to maintain calm, but David could see the anxiety in her eyes. The small details he had once been familiar with, her trembling hands, her tense face trying to remain polite, were all signs of a place that was hiding its decay, covering up cracks that anyone could see. This girl was not just a waitress. She was the embodiment of people struggling through life. People like David when he was a young man with unfulfilled dreams and hopes. Their world, the world of service workers, seemed to have lost the respect it once had. The people sitting at the first table, who were once the customers, now looked only at them with indifference, with suspicious eyes. David sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the table, taking in every detail. Everything in the restaurant bore the marks of being forgotten. The cracked wooden chair, the rug underfoot all wrinkled and dirty, the stains left over from previous dinners. The smell of garlic and oregano, things that once made the restaurant stand out, now only carried a staleness, no longer fresh or proud. The dishes no longer brought joy to the customers. Instead, they sparked disappointment and discomfort. Era moved between tables, walking lightly, but as though she couldn't shake off the heavy atmosphere surrounding her. She was not just serving guests, she was holding the room together, keeping it from falling apart. Her steps had become mechanical, like a machine without feeling, automatically doing its job without anyone seeing the sacrifices she made. She had become a symbol of exhaustion, resilience, but loneliness in this world. David's gaze never left her. He saw her hands, hands that were rough from time and labor, once the hands of an anonymous worker with no name, no age, no dreams. But today, beneath those hands, there was something different. She was no longer just a tired worker trying to survive. She stood at the crossroads between enduring and resisting. Her eyes, though smiling, did not simply express compliance. She looked at this world, not with fear, but with quiet determination. The other workers in the restaurant walked past, but none of them were like Aura. The others simply nodded as they passed, serving customers as though it were an emotionless job, devoid of passion, without self-respect. But Aura was different. Every plate she placed down carried meaning. Every glass of water she poured out showed a bit of hope, a bit of respect for the customer, even though she knew those things were no longer appreciated. David stared at Aura as though seeing himself in her. She was not just a worker in the system. She was a living proof of a forgotten class, a class that the powerful people in society and business could never understand. But David understood. He knew that this girl was not just a server. She held within her the strength the system had deliberately denied. The whole room seemed to shatter in his eyes. David felt the indifference of the staff, the neglect of the managers, the loss of the values that had once existed here. But more importantly, he felt something familiar. Aura could be the one to save this place, even though she didn't know it yet. And David knew he couldn't just stand by and watch. What he saw was betrayal. What he saw was not just the decline of a branch, but the failure of the very values he had built through years of struggle. The night remained unchanged, cold and dim. But for David, the atmosphere in the restaurant was now filled with tension. He continued to observe, each detail becoming clearer, each movement of Aura and the other employees holding an untold story. As the lights dimmed and the last plates were cleared, Aura didn't rush to leave like the others. She stepped out of the room like a ghost, her eyes cast down, her steps silent on the smooth tile floor. David couldn't help but focus on her every movement. In the quiet, he heard her exhale, as though trying to release the exhaustion of her weary body, but unable to. He knew Aura wasn't just a server here. She was carrying an invisible burden that no one else could understand. The cracks on her hands, the fatigue in her eyes, and the sorrow that lingered in her steps spoke of someone living in a world where her patience no longer hid her internal wounds. And that world was the very system David had created. He left his table and followed her. Though he said nothing, he could feel the weight in the air. Aura was just one of countless employees like her. People who had lived and worked under the shadow of an unjust system, where their dignity was stripped away and their dreams were slowly taken piece by piece. They were the silent bearers of the consequences of this decline. Those who had become accustomed to living quietly because for one reason or another, they had no other choice. As Aura walked through the empty streets, the dim streetlights illuminated the dark corners she passed. With every step, she carried a larger worry than the dinner shift, unpaid medical bills, a sick child waiting at home. For her, the late nights, the extra hours she worked to make ends meet, were the moments she wished she could escape from the weight pressing down on her. But she could never run away because her survival depended on it. David stopped, standing under the street lamp watching her. He knew she was facing tough decisions, and he couldn't look away. His gaze still held empathy, but it was also filled with anger at what he had built. This restaurant, the one he had once been proud of, had now become a place not only burdened by business failure, but also a symbol of the corruption of a system he had created. The employees here didn't just face the harsh realities of their profession, they had to sacrifice so much just to keep their jobs. Whether tired or not, they had to keep going. David knew he couldn't watch people like Aura be destroyed any longer. Something had to change. But the most important question now was, did he have the courage to expose what was happening, knowing it would threaten not only the business, but his own future? In that moment, David felt a decision beginning to form in his mind. He would no longer let things continue as they were. What had been overlooked, what had been ignored, would now have to face the truth. The cold of that night came not only from the sky, but from the heavy silence that filled the restaurant. David returned to his table, silently watching Aura from afar. Every movement she made, no matter how small, was filled with anxiety, an undeniable tension she couldn't hide. Her eyes were downcast, but in them, he saw exhaustion, not just physical, but emotional as well. As David lost himself in thought, a noise broke the silence. Corbin, the manager, entered from the back of the room, carrying with him the usual coldness. But this time it was thicker, heavier. David immediately noticed the look Corbin gave him. Sharp, like a blade, filled with a challenge, as though he knew David had already discovered the hidden truths. But David did not change his expression. He showed no sign of alarm. He picked up his glass of water and took a slow sip, like any other diner enjoying a meal, calm, unhurried, and composed. He knew that now was the moment to assess the situation, to decide what his next move would be. Corbin walked toward him, never taking his eyes off David, as if searching for the slightest hint of reaction to figure out whether David had discovered something. "You must be tired after the long trip," Corbin said, his tone casual, though it dripped with underlying contempt. "Everything here is fine. There's nothing to worry about. Creedy." David smiled faintly, a smile that wasn't warm, but just enough to show that he wasn't rattled by Corbin's words. He met Corbin's eyes, unwavering. He knew now that this wasn't just a failure of one branch. It was the betrayal of the very values he had worked so hard to build. "Really? Everything is fine?" David asked, his eyes gleaming with quiet defiance. "Then why do I feel like there's an atmosphere in here, like a room filled with gunpowder? Why do I feel like something's about to explode?" Corbin stared back at David, but didn't respond. The silence stretched, and David felt the tension thickening in the air. He had known people like Corbin before, people whose every move was calculated, whose words were simply a facade. But there was one thing Corbin didn't know. David had overheard the whispers in the kitchen, had seen Ara's fearful eyes, and felt the trembling hands. David couldn't just stand by and watch anymore. Ara reappeared by David's side while he faced Corbin, holding a tray of drinks. But her eyes never left David. There was an unspoken connection between them, a silent agreement. She knew he had discovered the truth, and now was the time to act. She placed the tray on the table, glanced quickly at Corbin, and then turned back to David. The words she had been about to say were cut short by a look from David. He understood what she was about to reveal, but this was not the right moment. David turned back to Corbin, his face now cold, no trace of hesitation or fear in his expression. "I've heard a lot about you, Corbin," he said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "But what I see today is not just a challenge to me, it's a challenge to the very values I built. I'm not afraid of your games, but what are you doing to us? Or do you just not care about what's happening?" Corbin smirked, his lips curling slightly as he stepped closer. "You don't understand, David," Corbin said, his voice cold. "This is how it works. You can't change everything just because of a few small issues. Just nod and keep things going, and everything will be fine." David smiled again, but this time his smile wasn't one of satisfaction. It was the smile of someone who knew what was coming. "No, Corbin, you're wrong. I'm not the kind of person to overlook what I see, and I'm not going to let people like you destroy what I've built." David's words cut through the tension in the room like a knife. They weren't just words. They were a declaration of war, a challenge to everything Corbin thought he had control over. David had realized that to protect what he had created, he couldn't just sit back and watch everything crumble. He had to fight, not just for his reputation, but for everyone who had trusted him, and especially for Ara, who had stood up for the truth despite the danger. And as he looked back at Corbin and Darius, he understood that this wasn't just a battle for power or money. It was a battle to reclaim dignity and trust, to recover the values that he once thought were invincible. The atmosphere in the restaurant seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as if everyone was waiting for a storm to hit at any moment. David felt the tension spreading from every corner of the room. The eyes of the employees, the customers, everyone was watching him, and there was an unspoken silence that could not be broken. Corbin's gaze never left him, as if he were trying to read David's thoughts. But this time, David didn't flinch. He knew what he had to do. Ara stood next to David, her hands clenched, her face showing no trace of fear, but her eyes were full of determination. David turned to look at her and realized that there was something in her that transcended exhaustion and anxiety. It was an unwavering belief in integrity, a firm resolve to fight against the injustice she had been enduring. She had endured too much, her silence stretched to its limits, but now she couldn't remain silent any longer. "Ara, I need to hear the truth," David said, his voice clear in the silent room. He wasn't just asking her to answer his questions, he was asking her to step out of the shadows of fear and speak the truth that everyone in that room deserved to hear. She looked at him for a moment, her eyes still full of anxiety, but after a brief hesitation, she nodded. Era knew that the time had come, and there was no turning back now. David had opened the door, and she could not close it again. She took a deep breath, her voice calm, but one could feel the turmoil underneath. I've worked here too long, seen too many things I couldn't speak of. But when Corbin came, everything changed. At first, it was small mistakes, wrong deliveries, food substitutions no one noticed. But then, things started to change. The suppliers changed, fake invoices started appearing, and it only got worse as more people joined. And I saw them start switching food with other good, Era said, each word heavy in her throat. But she continued without hesitation. David said nothing, only silently watching her, his eyes filled with understanding. He knew that she was not just a victim, she was someone with incredible strength. Someone who had stood up when faced with a system that was rotten from the inside. The price she had paid was immense, and now she was risking everything to speak out. David looked at her, his heart aching. I'll help you, he said, and these people won't get away with it. They made a mistake thinking that your fear would keep you quiet forever, but now we'll show them that silence is never the answer. Era nodded, her eyes now full of resolve. She was no longer the tired woman, afraid to face what was coming. She had stepped into the light, no matter how difficult the road ahead would be. David smiled slightly, a smile not of satisfaction, but one of quiet confidence. That's right. Now we can look those who have deceived us in the eye and not be afraid anymore. Both of them stood before Corbin and Darius, and in that moment, all the betrayal, all the deceit, was shattered. The men before them were no longer the powerful ones. They were the defeated ones, criminals waiting for their punishment. David turned away, his eyes fixed on the large door ahead, where freedom and justice awaited. This is the end, and this is the beginning. They had won, but this was only the first step in a long journey of recovery, a continuous battle to preserve the values David had once created. The cold wind of the evening blew through the car's window, carrying with it a silence that both occupants felt deeply. David and Ara sat quietly in the car, moving down an empty road, the streetlights casting faint glows that reflected off the car's windows. The air inside the car was dense, as though every breath held the weight of tension and resolve. After leaving the restaurant, the silence still clung to them. Ara stared out the window, saying nothing, but in her eyes was a mixture of fear and hope. She had done something she never imagined she could do. She had stood up and spoken the truth. But now she knew that the battle was far from over. Everything was just beginning. David looked at her quietly, his thoughts heavy. He had become accustomed to dangerous situations, but this time the danger did not come from an external enemy, but from the system he had spent years building. This was no longer just a battle to save a restaurant. This was a fight to reclaim dignity and the integrity that had been stolen. Ara, he spoke softly, his voice firm and resolute. You did the right thing. You know, I couldn't have done this without you. You're the only one who dared to see the truth, no matter the danger. She turned to look at him, her eyes no longer filled with confusion, but now with unwavering determination. She felt a change in herself, a change she never thought possible. She was no longer the weak person hiding in the shadows. She had stepped into the light, even though it might lead her down a difficult path. David, I can't go back. I can't keep ignoring what I've seen. And I can't let you fight this alone, Era said, her voice no longer trembling. We have to stop them before it's too late. If we don't, they'll keep exploiting us, just like they've done to everyone else. David nodded, his heart stronger than before. He had prepared himself for a long fight, but now he knew he wasn't fighting for himself alone. He was fighting for Ara, for the values he had once forgotten, and for all those who were buried in fear and injustice. We can't keep hiding in the shadows, David continued, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his gaze steady on the road ahead. I know I built this empire, but I also know that this empire isn't just about money and power. It's about trust. It's about integrity that I let slip, and now we're going to get it back. Ara stood still, but her heart was filled with emotion. What David had just said wasn't just empty words. She could feel his belief. and she knew she was a part of something bigger. A moment of silence passed, and only the sound of the car on the road remained. David glanced at her again, and this time, his smile wasn't one of arrogance. It was a promise. "We'll fight," David said, his voice resolute. "Together, and nothing will stop us now." Aura took a deep breath, her eyes now shining in the darkness. She no longer feared, no longer doubted. She had made her decision. Yes, together. The car continued its journey through the dark, the determination in each of them burning brighter than before. They were no longer the unnoticed, the insignificant. They were the ones leading the charge, the ones who would change everything. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would not stop. As they drove further into the night, David's thoughts drifted with every turn of the wheel. He no longer feared. They would go all the way to the truth, no matter the cost. The faint glow of streetlights from the surrounding buildings illuminated the car as it rolled along the empty road. David and Aura sat in silence, but both could feel the unusual tension in the air, as if time had momentarily stopped. They were heading toward a destination, one that would determine not only their fate, but also the fate of those buried in silence and fear. The sense of danger was thick in the air, but something new was also emerging. They were no longer the ones being pushed into the shadows of life. Now they were warriors, standing up to defend the values that had been betrayed. "David," Aura said, her voice unfamiliar, more resolute than ever before. "We can't just rely on the truth. They won't let us win that easily. We need to prepare thoroughly. We need a plan." David looked at her, nodding. He knew she was right. This wasn't anyone's personal fight. This was a fight for both of them. A fight not just to restore justice, but to recover the values that had been hidden for so long beneath the shiny surface of power. "Aura, I know," David replied, his voice calm and serious. "But the truth is our strongest weapon. Yes, they won't let us win easily, but if we use the truth right, we can defeat them from within. We need patience and strategy." He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his gaze fixed ahead. Though there was still much to do, he felt a steady belief forming within him. They would no longer be those who were pushed aside. They would be the ones leading the way. "Aura, I won't let you fight this alone," David continued, his eyes sharp, unwavering. "With you by my side, I'm not afraid of anything." She looked at him, and for the first time, there was no fear in her eyes. It was all clarity. She had made her choice, and she would no longer be the weak person hiding in the shadows. She had stepped into the light, ready to face whatever came next. "We have to show them that we're not people they can easily defeat. We have to act before they can destroy us," she replied, her voice low but resolute, like everything in her was suddenly crystal clear. The car continued down the empty road, but neither of them felt alone anymore. They were no longer unnoticed, no longer insignificant. They were the leaders, the ones who would change everything. And no matter how many challenges lay ahead, they would not retreat. David glanced at her again. His smile wasn't one of triumph, but one of silent promise. "We'll do this together." The drive through the night continued, but David and Aura were no longer just on a journey. They were on a mission, determined to face whatever lay ahead, with unwavering resolve. The faint light from the street lamps cast shadows on the car as David and Aura continued their journey. The road ahead was long, and the atmosphere around them felt heavy, as though they were moving through a darkened world where everything was uncertain. The silence between them was thick, like every breath held a weight of its own. "Aura, do you think we can uncover the truth without paying a price?" David asked, his voice soft but grave. His eyes were focused ahead, where the dark silhouettes of the city faded into the night. He had asked himself this question many times before, but now the answer mattered more than ever. Aura looked out the window where the dark night made everything seem blurry. She knew that David's question wasn't just a simple inquiry, it was a reminder. David was not weak, but the doubt within him about what they were doing was unavoidable. "David, sometimes the truth comes with a cost too high, but if we don't face it, the price we'll pay will be far worse. We can't keep living in the shadows. We can't let others control our lives," Aura replied, her voice steady. But underneath it, there was an undeniable truth. David nodded, his eyes still fixed on the road. He understood, and within himself, he knew that these words were not just comfort. They were the harsh reality that had to be faced. Part of him wanted to act quickly, but he also knew that they needed to be careful. "So what do you think our next step should be?" David asked, determined not to let doubt rule over them. It was time to act. Era turned to look at him, her eyes filled with resolve. "We need to go to their headquarters. That's the only place where we can find everything hidden. We need solid evidence. There's no time to waste on fear." David looked at her, and this time, his expression had no sign of hesitation. She was right. The price of truth couldn't be avoided, but it was a price they had to pay. If they didn't act now, everything would continue to fall apart. They couldn't let that happen. "All right, we'll do it, but we have to be careful. Every step has to be calculated. We can't rush," David emphasized. Era didn't speak, but the strength in her eyes said it all. "Thank you, David. We will get through this." The car continued its journey through the night, but this time, neither of them felt like they were merely driving toward a destination. They were heading toward a battle, one that would change everything. And no matter how hard the fight was, they would not stop. David's thoughts drifted with every turn of the wheel. He no longer feared what was ahead. They would go all the way to the truth, no matter the cost. They continued their journey, but the atmosphere in the car had shifted. After hours of silence, they now felt an undeniable connection, an unspoken understanding between them. David glanced at Era, who was no longer just a companion, but the only person who could help him stand firm amidst the storm of his life. "Did you ever think we'd make it this far?" Ara asked, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She didn't look at David, but her question pierced through the silence like a sharp arrow. David sat in silence for a moment, then replied softly, "At first I wasn't sure. I thought we wouldn't make it. But now, I believe we can change everything." Era lowered her head slightly, his words a confirmation of what she had felt all along. "That's right. We're doing the right thing, and nothing can stop us now." Their journey was no longer just a personal challenge for David and Ara. It had become a fight for justice, for truth. The secrets behind the doors of the headquarters were now their target, and they had made the decision to uncover them. No more doubts, no more hesitation. As the car turned down a quiet road, the last lights of the city slowly faded behind them, and only the darkness remained. The air felt even heavier, as if they were entering a place where the truth would either make or break them. But this time, they didn't feel fear. The fear had been conquered by their resolve. When they arrived, they said nothing. They simply exchanged a look that said everything. Everything had led to this moment. David reached out and took Ara's hand, a gesture that seemed small but was full of meaning. "Thank you," he said, his voice firm and steady. "Thank you for being here." Ara smiled, a soft smile that was full of quiet strength. "We've come this far together. There's no need to thank me." The massive door of the headquarters opened slowly. Blinding lights from within streamed out, but David and Ara stepped inside like two people who had shed their fears. They were ready to face whatever came next. They were the leaders now, the ones who would change everything. The silent battles were coming to an end, and nothing would stand in their way. As the door closed behind them, David's eyes scanned the room ahead, a feeling of resolve settling within him. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The door of the headquarters closed behind them, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the cold, empty hallway. The faint flicker of overhead lights cast long shadows, heightening the tension in the air. It felt like a storm was about to break, and David and Ara knew that this moment was the culmination of everything they had fought for. David and Ara walked into the meeting room, their steps calm, their presence unwavering. They were no longer the nervous or uncertain people they had been at the start of this journey. They had become determined warriors, ready for whatever confrontation lay ahead. Corbin was standing in the room, his cold gaze fixed on them. But this time, it wasn't just the usual disdain he had for them. There was something darker in his eyes, something hidden beneath the surface. Beside him, Darius stood, his broad shoulders tense, his eyes sharp like a predator waiting to strike. David took in the scene without flinching. He wasn't here to back down, nor was he here to beg for answers. He was here to make things right. He met Corbin's eyes and spoke, his voice steady and commanding. "I know everything. You can't deceive me anymore. You can't deceive anyone. The lights in the room flickered, the tension mounting, but there was no turning back. Era stood by David, her gaze focused, her resolve stronger than ever. They had come this far, and there was no retreat now. Corbin smirked, stepping forward with a dangerous air about him. "What do you think you're doing, David?" he asked, his voice smooth and mocking. "You think you can challenge me here? You really believe you have the power to change everything?" David didn't flinch. "I've seen enough. I know what you've done, and it's over." Corbin's smile faltered slightly, but Darius stepped closer, his movements calculated, menacing. "Anyone who dares challenge us will pay the price," Darius said in a low, threatening tone. "You think you can stop us now?" David's gaze never wavered. "The truth will stop you. It will always win." David didn't wait for their response. Instead, he pulled out his phone and displayed a series of images and audio recordings, undeniable evidence of the illegal activities Corbin, Darius, and their associates had been involved in. The evidence was irrefutable. There was nowhere to hide anymore. Corbin's expression shifted, no longer confident. He glanced at Darius, then back at David. The power he once believed he had was slipping through his fingers. Era stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "We've done the right thing. We won't let you destroy everything." David smiled, not in arrogance, but in quiet triumph. "That's right. We fought for the truth, and now it's time to face the consequences." In that moment, David and Ara were no longer just two individuals fighting for justice. They were symbols of the values they had reclaimed, and together, they had brought down the corrupted empire that had once been their own. They walked away from the room, not as defeated, fearful people, but as victors who had stood up for what was right. And though the fight had been long and difficult, they knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where truth and integrity would always prevail. The door closed behind them, and for the first time, there was no more fear. Only the promise of a new beginning. Thank you for following this story with us. If you found this video inspiring or it helped you see life in a new light, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any exciting and meaningful videos in the future. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next videos. Wishing you strength and confidence on your journey.